So let's get started. My name is Philip Ahn. I am a business analyst and UX lead at JBS International. And welcome. This is Pragmatic UX in the federal landscape. So our goals today is to go over a few things, right? One is to understand the limitations and roadblocks that UX designers run into when they encounter government regulations. In addition to that, one of the things that, another thing that we're going to talk about is how we can incorporate low effort but high impact practices that still brings in user input and user data. In addition to that, I'm going to talk about how we can use web analytics as a starting point with a case study. And lastly, we're going to talk about practices practices that allow for starting small and being able to expand from there. So a little bit about me. This was taken last week in Maine, but I have a background in education. Specifically, while I was in grad school, I really had an interest in organizational management. In addition to that, and before that, I did a lot of edutech. So that's where I really got involved with doing UX and building out interfaces. And fast forward, if you want to hear more of how I got here, and if you looked at my LinkedIn profile, you're probably wondering, wait, how does this guy have this job here? But it all makes sense, I promise. And overall, in addition to doing all this work at JBS, I also teach design thinking workshops in the DMV area. And I also teach UX design in the evening courses over at General Assembly. Hopefully I won't make you guys fall asleep. Try to keep things entertaining, and I will do my best to speak coherently and clearly. So let's begin. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about was I wanted to kind of examine what is the federal landscape, right? So when we read about UX design, I think one of the issues that we run into is that, especially working with government agencies, we're like, well, how does this translate to my work? So the Digital Services Playbook, back a couple of years ago, they came out with, I think, 13 points about what government agencies should be aiming to develop when they're building out websites, building out services and products for users. And the first three things that's in the playbook are understanding what people need, addressing the whole experience from start to finish, and make it simple and intuitive. And for those of you who have worked with government agencies, I feel like this is something that we definitely do not have in a lot of situations. So even from the very beginning, right? So let's start from the very beginning of when we're trying to get government work. We see a RFP come out, and we want to submit budgets. We want to essentially fill up our personnel. And the first thing that I noticed, from the different statements of work that I saw, is that proposal requirements, they don't actually have a lot of emphasis on user experience and also usability testing. In addition to that, a lot of personnel requirements, they don't actually even talk about UX designers, right? I've seen some proposals where they talk about business analysts who have experience doing UX, but ultimately UX design is usually put off secondary, or it's like people don't really put a lot of they just don't talk. They don't ask for UX designers. In addition, requirements, when there is mention of usability testing, it usually occurs during phase 2. A lot of the projects that we work on over at JBS, usability testing kicks in phase 2. And in addition to that, there's government regulation that limits the amount of users that agencies can reach out to. So I'm going to go over a few different, I'm going to go over, like, I guess just to prove my point, right? I found some quotes. So what I did was I went through maybe 10 or 12 different RFPs that have come on my desk in the last 6 months. And I just wanted to go over what, like, each proposal was going over. So in this first RFP, or statement of work, this was the only place that really talked about usability and users. And again, this was, so they focused on usability and focus group studies of websites, including recommendations for enhancements based on findings. This was listed for phase 2. So this would have happened after the product was initially released. In addition to that, this was the only mention when I did Command F on preview. This was the only mention of users. As you can tell, this is very broad. So this one is also phase 2, where they do ask for usability testing. And one of the things that I've come to note is that usability testing and research should always happen in the very beginning. But again, here there's also mention of usability, but it only happens later on during phase 2. And this is the same. And in terms of positions that are available, the only the only statement of work that really asked for designers was this one proposal that was looking for an information architect, and it was more along the lines of working with developers on creating structures of the website versus like actually performing research and being able to better understand like the users. So a few insights that I got from Command F-ing all of the different statements of works. Numerous federal agency statements, they put little to no emphasis on user-centered design. Oh, is that mine? Oh, never mind. No, it's okay. I'm guessing everyone who has a Samsung has the same alert. But yeah, so no, I also have odd hours too on my alarm. So in addition to that, federal agencies, they're usually skeptical. So at least from my experience as well, right? Or in general, like I think there's an overarching sentiment that UX design, it's something really fluffy and flashy that like really hip organizations incorporate into their practice. So in addition to that, there's little to no room to incorporate design. So when you're budgeting, a lot of times it's very difficult to budget for the research and the testing phase of UX. And that's something I guess we have to be really clever with the way we budget and plan and present our numbers to clients. And of course, as I've said several times already, usability testing, it's put off until phase 2. So another roadblock that we run into when we're trying to incorporate UX practices is the Office of Management and Budget. So in order to perform research, at least I would like to, it requires clearance from this office, and unfortunately, that takes a long time, and that kind of negatively impacts us when we're trying to be as agile as we can. So here are the requirements to not require clearance. 1, collecting identical information from 9 or fewer people. And that includes both researching and usability testing. In addition, surveying other federal agencies, bureaus, labs. So I guess like observing. Passive means of obtaining feedback and comments without using structured questions. Actually, this is really important, and I'll get back to that later on. And lastly, we create hotlines and complaint systems where users can actually reach out to us. So this puts us into a pickle, right? We're not able to continuously research. We're not able to understand our users more, right? So I'm sure you guys, for those of you who might have incorporated UX practices in your work, it's you talk to users, you come up with a few insights, but usually what ends up happening is you come up with more questions where you're like, oh, well, I need to do more interviews. But unfortunately, if we're limited to only 9 people, we are kind of limited with what we can do. In addition to that, we're not able to explore our assumptions. So part of, I guess, doing good research is having good research goals. And of course, if we only have passive means to get in touch with our users and collect feedback, it makes it really difficult for us to have a targeted approach to understand what our users want. And lastly, the data collection is very passive. So the last bullet point with hotlines and complaint systems, we get a hold of a very specific user type, usually the ones that are very strong-willed, and I guess people who have a lot of strong feelings towards the government. So the three issues that I wanted to address today. One is, how do we incorporate UX practices in a way that doesn't require a full design team? So generally, designers, we have on our team, right? We have one web designer, and usually UX designers are really not even a part of the conversation. Secondly, how do we make data-driven practices with projects that do not inherently contain research and design in the development process? And lastly, how do we bring UX research methods when there are few resources and little to no budget to support it? So I feel like this is kind of the story of my life, where I try to get by with little to no resources. And here's where I wanted to talk about Pragmatic UX. So just to kind of, the few things I wanted to talk about today are the difficulties. So again, we run into unconvinced clients when we try to present what user needs are. They probably say like, oh, well, like, do you really need to conduct the research when we're trying to, just add this simple fix? Can't you just do that? Another roadblock that we often run into is when there is, when we tell the clients or when we tell stakeholders that a certain feature might take longer due to the fact that we need to do more research and design. And of course, agencies sometimes they contract out different portions of work. So from personal experience, I might be doing UX on a product that I have no control over in terms of the development, and in terms of connecting with the developers, requires official channels to get in touch with them. And lastly, of course, I'm sure there are some of you here who might have experienced services like products that you might have inherited from other organizations that might not have done the best job, and essentially being able to reverse engineer that, being able to trying to understand the logical flow of what the previous development team did to build out your products. So these are, of course, different issues that we run into, and essentially with Pragmatic UX, here's a few things that I think in terms of here's what I guess the strategy that I try to incorporate. So business analysts, they are empowered to play the role of UX practitioners, and their job when they're writing out acceptance criteria and planning and requirements planning, it's to essentially tie that to the user. So they essentially, all the requirements that we incorporate, we put into consideration, will the user be able to feel an impact? In addition to that, we continuously conduct user research and usability testing with the requirements that we are creating. And we focus on using low-effort tools to communicate prototypes with the team and deliver efficiently and effectively. And of course, if there are requirements that are too broad, we break them down into simpler tasks, and the team follows a set number of rules that we created, where tasks are written out that are smart, right? So smart meaning, specific, measurable, attainable, repeatable, and tangible. Ooh, sorry about that. And I guess the strategy, this kind of occurs, so at least in our development cycle, where we're trying to continuously become more agile. The pragmatic UX occurs when we are grooming the backlog. So as business analysts, we are responsible for owning the few products, several products, and when we're writing out requirements, when we're creating tickets on Jira, we make sure that every ticket or every issue that we talk about, or every feature that we try to introduce, we make sure that there is enough context where we talk about the research, we provide any sketches that are necessary, and also test criteria of what would validate if a feature is completed or not. Oh, and so then, of course, during the development period, at the very end, the business analyst / UXer is able to perform the acceptance testing. based off of what was written in the ticket writing in the beginning. And of course, I think this also works in waterfall as well. So I know a lot of us are trying to move away from this, but I think there's still a lot of people who still incorporate this into their practice, and essentially it still works. So pragmatic UX, right? When you're writing out the requirements, that's when you work with the client and when you work with your team to kind of identify, okay, like what's the context behind this? What research needs to be done? What tests need to be made? And of course, during the design phase, that's when we actually conduct the research and we create quick sketches together. And during the verification period, that's also when the business analysts and clients and stakeholders all take part in testing to make sure that users are able to perform the tasks that we want them to do. So the things that we keep in mind when we're moving, when we're, I guess, designing and when we're doing our research on the user, I took this straight from 18F. So you can find this on their website. I changed services into products. So the first thing that we always ask, of course, is who are our primary users, right? Who are the end users? What are the user needs that that this feature will address? Why does the author need why does the user need this? Which people will have difficulty? Which research methods were used? What were the key findings, and how are the findings documented, and where can future team members access the documentation? And finally, how often are you testing with real people? In addition to that, we have another checklist that we always try to come back to when we're talking about creating stuff for the users. Early in the project, we spend time with the users, we perform our research, we make sure that we have a good understanding of who our users are, and we also try to identify what information we're missing. In addition to that, we use different quantitative and qualitative methods to determine what people's goals and needs are. And I'll walk you through kind of a quick case study of what we did in the past. In addition to that, we test prototypes of solutions with real people in the field. And of course, we document and we provide reports for any clients or stakeholders that do want this information. And of course, when I am working with the team, we always think about like, okay, like how will the user experience this feature that we're building? And we also try to prioritize our features to make sure that users are being able to, I guess, have access to the features as much as possible. So we tend not to use a lot of user stories. So we incorporate it into our discussions. I personally don't, though, but it does. But I think it's a good exercise to definitely have when we're talking about user needs. And as the digital service is being built, like how often are we testing this? Or how often are we testing the features that we're building out? So when we're building all this stuff, I'm pretty sure like this kind of goes against a lot of what I mentioned before, where clients might be against UX research testing, and I thought of this scene when Bender in Futurama gets lost in space and he meets an entity similar to God, and essentially he gets into a very philosophical discussion about what can God do, right? So he gets really frustrated because if you don't know for context, he recently just destroyed 2 civilizations that grew out of his tin body. And so if you don't know what I'm talking about, Hulu has every episode. But anyways, at the very end, the solution or the advice that God gives to Bender is that when you do things right, people won't be sure you've done anything at all. And essentially, that's the approach that I try to take when when we're trying to incorporate UX principles. I don't want the client feeling overwhelmed or frustrated over the fact that we spent X number of hours or X number of times, X minutes working on the research and design. So a goal that we often repeat in the office is low effort, high impact. So our goals, of course, it's to conduct cheap and fast research. So the research that we conduct, it's relatively free. In addition to that, we test small and we implement minor changes first. And the goal is to collect data as efficiently as possible, maintain sustainable and attainable practices. This is probably at least to me, this is really big, mainly because if you don't do this, who will, right? And I think when projects kind of become overwhelming, how can we make sure that we still put UX design and UX research as a top priority? So if you see here, this is a very abridged version of the design thinking framework that a lot of design thinking consultants incorporate and what they use when they're trying to facilitate a workshop. What I wanted to do was talk about these 3 areas. So the 3 areas that I want to focus on is how we empathize, or how we conduct research on the user's needs and motivations. In addition to that, I want to talk about how the team creates solutions with the user in mind, and how do we verify that our assumptions and solutions are heading in the right direction. So a few tools that we use, very general so far. We talk about web analytics. There's also informal interviews, so that's very different than user interviews or focus groups. We also create personas. We incorporate user flows during the planning and testing, and I guess like empathizing portions. We also focus a little less on software and try to do things with pen and paper. And of course, we try to incorporate cheap methods to make sure that we're doing the right thing. So web analytics, sorry, that was loud. So essentially, we primarily use Google Analytics, and I think with the Web Solutions team, we put a high priority on incorporating this into every service that we provide this as a service to every project that we work on. And we use web analytics not for marketing purposes, but to understand user behavior and site interactions through web analytics. And we also are able to see how users are visiting the site and how they're accessing the site, and we're able to see how users are navigating through the site as well. We're able to also gain more insight on who's visiting our site and who the actual users are. And we also get to see bounce rates. Where are people leaving? And of course, we get to determine if users can easily interact with the functionality of the site. So this was a site that we recently launched, Go for Life. For a little bit of context, it's a campaign done by the National Institute of Aging where they want to promote healthy exercise and healthy living lifestyle habits for older citizens. And in order to, I guess, what we ended up doing in the beginning was we thought, okay, so this is obviously targeted towards older people, but we also wanted to provide easy access to the caregiver. So the caregiver, in the initial launch, when we were talking with clients, they told us that it was, people, baby boomers who are like in their 50s and 60s taking care of like their 80s and 90-year-old grandparents. So we were like, all right, that's cool. So we let Google Analytics run, and we found something really interesting. So of course, we have all age groups visiting Go for Life, but we found 2 major insights, and usually data doesn't look this good. But essentially, there was a surge, or there's a large number of people in the 18 to 34-year-old age range who were visiting this site. And also, I can't read that number correctly, but that's, what's 100 minus, it's around 65%. Percent of the users were identified as female, or the algorithm on Google Analytics told us that, these were women visiting the site. So this was really interesting. In addition to that, we were able to see where people were clicking on the most. So we looked at the pathways. We looked at the URLs that people were visiting, and there's a lot of emphasis on guides, PDFs, tip sheets, and again, this was also really interesting to us as well. And of course, we created custom events where we were able to measure and determine what people were clicking on. So we found that people were trying to get access to PDF downloads. They're trying to print the pages. They were clicking on certain articles, and of course, there was a significant number of people who were clicking on PDFs. So this is all really interesting. So we have all these numbers, and we know who to target. So the question then is, well, why do they want to visit the site? So this is where qualitative data becomes really important. And essentially, we came across this roadblock where we're like, okay, we want to talk to these people, but we could only reach out to 9, and our client was kind of hesitant about giving us permission to talk to whomever and do formal interviews. I don't think they wanted to pay for a focus group, and also like setting that up took a long time. So they were like, "Can you do this faster?" And of course, my answer is yes. And the way we did this is through informal interviews. So essentially, the easiest way to put this, they're just conversations, right? And we spoke with potential users and tried to gain insight on their motivations, needs, and behaviors. So the people that we targeted, of course, were coworkers, friends, and family who fit in that 18 to 34-year-old demographic. We asked them questions along the lines of, okay, like, what do you like? Are you in close contact with your family, with your parent, with your mother, with your father? Like, how do you help them? What are you worried about them as they get older? And we were able to gain a lot of insight on what their concerns are. And of course, we don't expect them to, all have good knowledge of Go for Life, but we were able to collect a lot of insight on their concerns, and like we were also able to learn about what their schedules look like, and to maybe piece together and create insights on how they were, I guess, interacting with their parents, and why they were maybe worried about their parents. In addition to that, we saved a lot of money conducting formal interviews. It requires a lot of coordination, a lot of scheduling. Same with focus groups. I don't think we have the bandwidth on our team to do focus groups. So that, I think overall, we were able to have conversation, and we use this knowledge. And again, like this doesn't require a lot of note taking, and this actually fulfills the criteria. I think the third criteria of the OMB's policy on being able to reach out to users, right? By having discussions with no targeted goals, right? We're able to have essentially informal, candid conversations about how people feel about their parents. And I guess like I would say that there are definitely this has some limitations when we're talking about like certain products that might where like people are concerned about their people being concerned about their parents is a pretty universal thing, but we were able to use this in this particular case. So the structure that I like to do, so this is actually a screenshot of something that I use when I teach my students on how to conduct interviews. So instead of just asking them like, okay, like what do you do, right? We try to uncover what are people's organic processes. So like so in this particular case, what are people doing to get in touch with what are people doing when they're trying to get in touch with their parents and trying to help them out? In addition, why are they helping them out? So you have two pathways when you're essentially conducting these interviews. You can either ask them how they do something organically. So you want to start with how they do it. And then as the interviewer, your job is to figure out, okay, what is ambiguous or what sounds interesting to you or different than your expectations, and then have them elaborate. Secondly, if you're trying to understand why someone is motivated to do something or why do they do the things that they do, right, you want to ask them why they do it, right? And then, of course, you want to figure out, well, what is pushing them to do this, right? How are they feeling when they're trying to do something for their parents? And of course, anything else that sounds really interesting or insightful, you want to keep asking about that as well. And these conversations, they don't have to last long, right? I don't know, I guess if you're talking to a good friend, it'd be awkward to cut off your conversation after 10 minutes. But these conversations, they could last anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes to, a dinner. So we have all our research, right? So these are our two basic ways to approach our quantitative and qualitative data. And this is our starting point, of course. So we're now in the process of synthesizing all of our data. And the business analysts, they focus on taking the research and providing insights to the developers, right? And also, I guess, the clients, they want to be able to tell the story, right? What are the users doing? Why are they doing it? And how are they doing it? So the two tools that we use, the first one is a persona. So if you don't know what a persona is, a persona is an archetypal user that you have in mind. You want to start small. I think a lot of people are tempted to try to create 5 or 6 different personas, but especially when you're working on a team where you're first incorporating UX principles into your development process, you want to target one user first and then expand as you continue to gain more insight on who your users are. So if you go back to our demographic breakdown, I would probably focus on the 18 to 34-year-old age range first. And of course, second, by the way, I'll demonstrate I'll show what these two are. The second tool that we use are user flows. So user flows, it's a flowchart of what people do. And we try to map out how people do something organically, or when we're working with the development team, we try to map out the sequence of pages or interactions that the user will have to go through when they're trying to complete a process. And so these are really helpful. We like to put them up. We like to bring them up pretty frequently, and we use them a lot when we're planning. So when we're building up personas, the four areas that we try to focus on is we try to understand their personal, who is this person, right? So like we're talking like real stuff, like what is the age, what's the gender, or what gender do they identify with, what is the highest level of education this person has received. In addition, when we jump into the professional, we talk about, okay, like how much work experience does this have, what is this person's job, what does their day-to-day look like, and in addition to that, how do they process information? Is their job like high stress levels, or do they have time to do a lot of free time stuff? When we jump into the technical, we try to understand, okay, like what is this demographic or what is this persona's technical expertise? How well can they use computers? What kind of apps do they use? How much web browsing do they do? And also what devices do they use? And of course, lastly, and probably the most important, from our user interviews, we're able to capture what is the user motivated by. So like what motivates the user to seek out help on their parents? What are they looking for, as well as what is your person looking to do, and what are his or her needs? So if you see here, this is a quick persona that I created for the 18 to 34-year-old age persona that we had in mind, or the user group that we had in mind. So we have Mary Careful, and we tried to use the data that we had. So we found when she was browsing the web, she tended to look at food and cooking and health-related websites. In addition to that, these people use primarily their desktops at work, and they also look at they browse the web with their smartphones. When we think about what sites they visit, we try to imagine through our interviews. We picked up on people using Instagram, Washington Post, or news outlets. So. And essentially, from our interviews, we're able to understand that Mary was trying to find a way to get help for her grandmother, and of course, her mom made her go on the web and find information for her grandmother. And of course, the goal is to be able to provide support for her mother and her grandmother while she's also working a busy 9-to-5 job. So a lot of this you're probably wondering too. It's just like, okay, how detailed do you have to get? And I think it's a tricky question to answer because it depends on the situation, right? So there's always the concern for overfitting, but I think there are some areas that you can definitely be a little bit imaginative, as long as it falls in the realm of reality. And of course, there were some blanks here that there are insights that we didn't have, and there are some holes that we needed to fill. So. Anyways, what we did was we presented the new persona to the clients, and they were like, whoa, what? And then we showed them the analytics. We showed them through our process, and they're like, you did all this? And essentially, they came on board with redoing the information architecture and being able to rethink how we're going to prioritize the content on the Go for Life page. So as of last Monday, the site is now live. Yeah. So another thing that we use when we do planning, right, and when we put the user in mind, are user flows. So our workflows, they help the team understand how users will experience the site. And I think I don't think it's the developer's responsibility to be able to map out exactly what the user will go through, because they're too busy. They're really busy trying to figure out, okay, what technology am I going to use, and what module am I going to implement when we're trying to fulfill this feature. So your job as the business analyst and UX practitioner is to be able to map that out for the user and for the developers, and I guess also your clients, and being able to work together and see what's missing. So if the developers identify what mechanisms need to be built, the analysts determine how users will be impacted by the team's development. And of course, the end result leads to the scope of the work and tangible acceptance criteria. So the user flow, depending on how complex it gets and the technology that we need to build out, or the ambiguity that might exist, if we're working off of a few assumptions, that might help us, that might make us perform more extensive user testing. Or if we're building out an interface that no one really knows what to do, then we might have to do a little bit more, we might have to put in a little bit more emphasis on doing mockups and wireframes. So if you don't know what a user flow is, added this quick illustration that I did on Google Slides. It's just the squares all represent different interactions or different events that occur when someone is experiencing something. So this also applies to IRL. When if you're waking up, right, you wake up, you get coffee, you get donuts. This would be the same way when someone interacts with the website. So, of course, ours aren't that pretty. So most of our user flows are all written down on our whiteboard. And essentially, if you see all the different colors, if the blue is the initial user flow that I have in mind in terms of if something I have in mind, then all of a sudden the developers and the tech lead would always be able to interject and say well, what about this, or what about that, or that doesn't align with the data flow that I've already created, or it doesn't work with the data structure that we have in mind. Then we'll go back and we'll continue to revise, and then we'll think about, okay, so we're submitting a form, then it goes to who, then how do they give it back to us or to the user? So we have all these questions, right? And this is a really good tool to keep in the middle, where people are able to vocalize how they feel, where they're able to express what technology works and doesn't work in this particular feature. And it's not clean, it's not, part of it is to be able to get all of your conflicts and frustrations and concerns onto the whiteboard. Yeah. So this is where, with the personas, with the user flows that we have in mind, the development team, they meet to discuss what the possible solutions are. So the business analyst comes to this planning meeting with all of their information and knowledge from the research that they've done. And in addition to that, whenever we make a decision, we always think, okay, that's cool. We chose what technology we're going to use. How is the user going to interact with that? In addition to that, as I said, we use user flows to map out what needs to happen. And of course, by the end of planning, there's a list of requirements drafted into measurable acceptance criteria. So a few things to mention, right? So we've now defined, what needs to be done. We have all of our features planned out. We know how much work is going to be put in, and and the developers know what technology they're going to incorporate. So when we another way to make sure that everyone's on the same page is we do rapid prototyping. So Sketch, Photoshop, Adobe XD, Balsamiq, well, not Balsamiq, because I think Balsamic's relatively easy, but all that software, we try to cut that out, and we stick with good old low fidelity mockups. And essentially, we try to do it off the cuff. We do it on Post-it notes, on the back of napkin. No, that's not true. We do it on the back of scrap paper, or at least I do. And I think Balsamiq is a really good tool to use. I'm not sponsored by them, but I think it's relatively easy to work with, and it looks really clean. In addition to that, one thing that we incorporated into our practice is that if there is something heavily user-centered, we make sure that there is always a mock-up or a wireframe that developers have a good understanding of, so that way they're able to add the right building blocks, and the front-end developer is able to theme based off of that. And of course, the front-end developer and web designer, they work together with the business analyst to plan theming, especially for mock-ups or new templates that are complex or brand new. That's something that I probably wouldn't be able to show with my artistic talent. And of course, these are how simple they look, right? This in total probably took a total of 3 seconds. The yellow was to indicate that it needs to be more pushed towards the center. And and I was just essentially I was trying to draw out what the homepage would look like in my mind. We've also done, we've done a little bit more collaborative efforts to build out sketches. And this is maybe done with 2 or 3 people in the room. Also when we make a lot of mistakes, so we can make sure we erase everything that we do poorly. And essentially we're able to take notes on the side, and essentially at the end of the meeting we take a screenshot, we add it to our ticket, and the back-end developer and well as the front-end developer, they have a good understanding of what to do and what to build out. And of course, Balsamic, this is used on a page that we're about to build out. And and again, same thing. You could create markups. This probably took a total of maybe half an hour. So again, like these are very low stakes, low effort means to make sure that people are on the same page and everyone is thinking about the user as they're building out the websites that we're building. So the last section I wanted to talk about was the testing that we do. So we have really cool tests that a lot of O&M uses. They have all these security tests. We do like URL link breaking tests. We make sure that everything is 508 compliant. But ultimately, I think a good way to give a go or no go on a feature that's about to be deployed, it's user acceptance, right? Can the user do the feature, perform the tasks that we've built out for them? And essentially, we put a high priority on this. So I know in a lot of government agencies, this is like the very last step before we ship. This is built we build out user acceptance testing from the very beginning. So once we build everything out, we try to bring in users, we try to bring in clients, we try to bring in clients who are willing to contribute, and also like different stakeholders that we think represent the user. And essentially, we try to also have non-tech people come in and perform these tasks that we have in mind. So the reasoning behind this, of course, we are trying to make sure that the users are really being thought of when we're building out our features. So the main focus is to verify if the users are able to complete the task, right? We make sure that we just make sure that that everything that we built is good for a non-IT person. So sometimes that includes me. Well, not sometimes. Most of the times that includes me. So the way that we do this, right? So this was a page that we also released. This is from BLSA, which is Baltimore Longitudinal Studies Studies on Aging. And essentially, this is one page where we wanted to add a sortable filter. And essentially, in our acceptance criteria, we made sure that that users were able to select a field, and once they clicked it, it was able to sort alphabetically. And essentially, this ticket was created even before any work was done, and we made sure that, we just made sure that the developers knew what they had to build. So at the very end, I could just give this ticket or share this ticket with our client or with whoever's testing this, and they can say, hey, I just read what you wrote down, I did it, and it works. Or it doesn't work, and you have to go back to the drawing board. And of course, another way that we can test, something that we've been trying a little bit more of, is to make our voting or make our testing a little bit more democratic, where we're able to bring in multiple people. So essentially, let's say we're thrown into a situation where we have 3 different mockups. Everyone kind of feels strongly about one versus the other, but we can't come to a conclusion, right? So everyone kind of argues like, no, this works because of this, or that works because of that. And of course, that we're not working with data, right? We're working with what our preferences are. So what we did was there was a recent instance where we created 3 different mockups of the same page. And we just printed it out and we did it ourselves. We did the testing ourselves in-house. So overall, the only cost that it took, the amount of money that it took was virtually nothing. Our production guy, Tony Chin, so shout out to him for being able to print out the 3 mockups that were designed by our web designer. And of course, we posted them on the wall. And by the end of day 1, my director took a picture of this and sent it to me. And essentially, we had people passing by. So this is at the front entrance of our office. And people passing by just put on stickers on which mockups they liked. So by tomorrow when I go in, so I've been working remotely most of this week, but when I go into the office tomorrow, I can see which mockups stood out the most. So of course there's drawbacks to this. in the sense that, like the way that someone sees a poster versus a web page does differ. But ultimately, we still have some data, right? It's rather than telling our clients like, hey, like we thought this is the best. Now we can go to the client and say, here's what people thought, here's what people gravitated towards. So now we know which mockups to go with. So again, this is relatively cheap. I had to bother production, but we were able to get this done in probably like less than a week. It took me 5 minutes to set this up. It took longer to tape this than to, like write out the tickets for this. Wait, no, that's not true. It's the other way around. It took longer for me to write out the tickets than to tape this up on the wall. So the benefits of all this, of course, overall, I think with this approach, similar to what Bender learned from God, we are able to maintain almost the same runway. So when we're grooming our backlog, there's no specific time dedicated towards like a design sprint. So I know like Google Ventures recently published an article where they talked about like, oh, here's like our 1 week process. It's like, no, well, we don't have it formalized because we want to incorporate these small practices that eventually will become part of our practice. We got to start somewhere. In addition to that, the team can continue to work, incorporate more advanced UX tools. So with our clients, we're slowly able to convince them, and we're able to incorporate more UX research into our budget, into our planning, into our timelines. With one particular client, like we went as far as conducting like actual formal user testing on a certain feature that we were about to build out and deploy. So that was really cool. In addition to that, they see clients. Maybe there's a level of distrust towards like people's preferences, but clients, they don't see people's preferences or assumptions. They see people's decisions. And and I think overall, like we rely heavily on data and research before we move forward with any decision. And also, this is kind of a side benefit, but developers, I think, with at least in front of my face, they tell me that a lot of the things that I do, brings a lot more clarity towards the work that they have to build. They're not thrown into the dark where they're like, okay, I don't know what I have to build. But now they have proof, they have evidence, they also have information about who the users are, and also they have someone to reach out to if they need a little bit of help in making a decision. And of course, most importantly, we have happier users. I think I probably didn't talk about them at all, but overall, like the goal is to get more people to use the products that we build, I hope. So just some concluding thoughts before we wrap up. Just overall, UX design, it's a strategic business practice. I don't think, like everyone talks about it as some like fluffy, like new magical thing. Well, it's not really new anymore, but they talk about it being like this like creative, innovative space, but it's really not. UX it's a good business practice, so that way people use your products, right? There's a reason why certain products stand out over others, just because of the fact that users have an easier time working with them. In addition to that, keep things small, keep things cheap. Usually, at least with my experience working with startups or with companies with little to no funding, they want to see proof before they're able to provide more support. You want to align deliverables to real data. Remember, like data doesn't lie, right? I mean, I guess there are ways data can lie, but ultimately data does show evidence towards the decisions that you make. Share the process, right? Share the love. I think this is something that a lot of clients are beginning to understand. But again, like there's still a gap between what user-driven design is versus like I guess what they see and what on their real projects versus like what they hear about. And yeah, that's it. So thank you. And if you need a URL to get to the presentation, here is the URL. And thank you. Any questions, any concerns, any thoughts? Oh, yeah.
I have a question about the 18 to 24 statistic that was on the analytics.
Mm-hmm.
Usually that's college age, and I know from a lot of the news, geriatrics is a growing field as far as study.
Mm-hmm.
Did they think about at all that the government site was being used as a research tool? Because I know when I worked for the U.S. International Trade Commission. We had 4C that people would fill out, and most of the young people were saying, I'm here to do research for a paper.
Yeah. No, absolutely. So one of the concerns that we had was exactly that, and we also saw that a lot of people visiting were coming from EDU, coming from like university ISPs. So we controlled for that when we were trying to filter out our users. Yeah. Yeah, sir.
Sorry if you went over this a bit, but I was wondering, what was one of the most surprising difficulties you came across when going through this process? How did you guys deal with it?
So I would say the biggest difficulty, at least that I've observed, was, I'm going to be careful with my words, but I would say that a lot of internal stakeholders weren't satisfied with the decisions that we were making with our new approach. Partly because like a lot of in the past, I guess, also like I haven't worked at JBS long enough to like I don't feel confident saying a lot of things in front of people there, just because I'm still relatively new compared to other people. But ultimately, there was a precedent set where like some creative director or some like Don Draper would be like, here's the strategy, here's the direction that we're going to move forward with. But now all of a sudden you have myself and other team members saying like, listen, you're actually wrong, and here's how we're going to do it. Or especially once we move on to the next level, right, where when the client's asking us for issues, for fixes or new features, and we say like, well, that's going to take, here's our timeline because we want to actually incorporate real like UX research, then the director might say like, oh, well, that's too much time. Can't you deliver it sooner? So that's like usually the phase 2 really kind of gets in the way, because they're like, well, you've been doing this already like so cheaply. Why can't you do this like cheap again? So that's kind of been at least that's my observation. I'm sure there are other clients that might not be happy with like maybe introducing new and extra things, but that's at least been my I guess anecdotal experience. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, sir.
The persona thing kind of concerns me,
Mm-hmm.
because the more you make it real like that, you sort of generalize to like a white young women professional, and there's a lot of other constituents you're likely to have for the site.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
And so I'm wondering if that does more harm than good, because, yeah.
Yeah, so ultimately, that, like, I feel like whenever I teach UX, right, a lot of people, like, my answer a lot of times is it depends, right? So the risk with personas is exactly that, right? You either create a fictional person, you overfit like all this data into this one person that like is probably not even true, not even real. And I think part of your job as a UX designer then is to look at the research, continuously look at the analytics, right? So it's not just like a one-stop shop where it's like, okay, like we have all the research done, we're gonna work with Mary Caregiver for the rest of our like 6 months building out this website. So part of my job at least is to make sure that my insight or my interpretation of the users is real and accurate. So that's where, even now, right, like I think even last night, right, I was at a CVS and there was a woman in front of me and she, it's awkward. I was pretty much soliciting her, but just asking her just like, oh, like I see the medicine that you're buying, like can, if you don't mind me asking, like, do you, like, who's it for? And like just trying to gain more insight on like what people are concerned about. So yeah, so you have two solutions, right? So one is to go back and adjust your original persona, or secondly, you might need to create more personas. So that's where we go in, where now instead of just Mary, right, maybe we're also thinking about another woman in the similar age group and demographic, but with different interests and concerns and different jobs. So a good example recently that I saw was actually really spot on was there's a startup in the Bay Area called Zoom, so Z-U-M-E, Pizza. So they they're like the Silicon Valley version of Domino's. So they created a bunch of robots to create cheap and affordable pizza, but of course with high quality ingredients. So their two major customer base, it's like your young 25-year-old software engineer from San Jose, and also your 30-something-year-old mom who has like 2 kids. And part of that is because now they have very overlapping needs, but where their technical expertise is very different, their their motivations are different as well too, right? So like the software engineer, it's all about himself, doesn't know how to cook, just finished like a 10-hour shift at Google, while like the mother is just picking up the kids at practice and she doesn't want to cook on a Tuesday night or a Friday night, and then she those two considerations, they're continuously developing too as they continue to do their research as well. And you want to either get more specific or more general depending on what your data shows and what your data tells you. Yeah, if that answers your question. Yeah, cool. Yeah, anyone else? All right, cool. Yeah, so thank you so much. Oh, yes.
I was just going to make a comment about at the very beginning when you were explaining how to get around the OMB requirements. There's like, I believe a mention on the next slide about how you can tap into resources that you already have, such as like a complaint, some way to pull complaints or gather complaints or whatever.
Yeah.
One of the things that, like on bigger government websites, has been really helpful is having like if you have a web support email address, you can use that for quantitative data and how many emails have we gotten about the difficulty of using X or confusion with whatever part of a product. But I just thought that was interesting because I just read it in a UX book as well. But they just mention it, and in reality it can be massive when you have no other way to collect data.
No, and I think like that kind of data is really helpful because you're able to see, like if 10 people complain about your e-commerce site, right? You obviously know that there's something wrong with your site. You should investigate it. But the concern also then is like you think about the people who do send complaints, and it's one type of person usually. So it's like, like loudest voice is usually like it's the vocal minority, right? So so that's like the only pushback I would have. But I think it's all, you got to use what you have, right? So like if you use that to like prove something with your client, like you better know what the risks of using that data are.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, cool. Thank you.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks so much, guys. Cool. Finished right on the dot. So thank you so much.